afternoon from Singapore, and welcome to our audience members joining us from across the globe. Welcome to a virtual panel hosted by the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. Today's discussion is titled Looking Beyond Trump's Trillion-Dollar Diplomacy in the Gulf. I'm Clemens Che, a research fellow at the Institute, and I will be moderating today's proceedings. We are very happy to have you all with us today to participate in this discussion examining President Trump's visit to the Gulf, which included Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. I'm delighted to be welcoming an excellent panel of experts from the region to help us unpack various elements of Trump's visit. Before I introduce our panelists, I would like to remind our audience that if you have a burning question during the discussion, please key in your questions into the Zoom Q&A box. And as we move along, I will direct them to our speakers. We will try to keep this conversation as candid as possible, if we can. But first, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our two speakers. I'd like to welcome Dr. Hassan Al-Hassan, who is the Senior Fellow for Middle East Policy at IISS, the International Institute for Strategic Studies. He specializes in the foreign policies and economic statecraft of the Gulf Arab states. His latest project at IISS, entitled Gulf Bailout Diplomacy, Aid as Economic Statecraft in a Turbulent Region, is a groundbreaking study on the politics of Gulf rescue lending in the MENA region. Welcome, Hassan, the chairman of Muscat Policy Council, Oman's first independent think tank dedicated to advancing research, policy studies, and dialogue to address global challenges. Dr. Al-Balushi is actively involved with international think tanks specializing in regional security and geopolitics. His research is on GCC developments with a notable emphasis on Oman's domestic strategies and foreign policy. Now let us dive into the tasty bits of today's topic, President Trump's visit to the Gulf. The visit saw Mr. Trump leave with bountiful billion-dollar deals on AI, other high-tech defense, energy, and aviation, alongside very heavy commitments to invest in the US economy. The optics were very comfortable in terms of how relaxed Trump was in his interactions with the Gulf leaders that he saw eye to eye with. I wrote a piece that was released a couple of days ago offering a more subdued assessment of the president's visit, highlighting that regional stability and various files are still up in the air. Various files are still unresolved. But this is where I would like to turn to our speakers for their perspectives from the region itself. So I would like to ask our speakers, amid that whole pomp and ceremony, what is your realistic assessment of Trump's visit to the Gulf? And I'm asking with the regional perspective in mind, is there sustainability in the kind of deals that were secured during his trip? Was defense and security taking a backseat? We certainly saw some of these defense statements appearing in the respective fact sheets by the White House. And perhaps this was also discussed during the Gulf-US summit, but it was certainly secondary in terms of media coverage. But I'd like to hear from our speakers. Perhaps we will start with Hassan first. Over to you, Hassan. Thank you.
Well, sure. Thank you very much, Clemens, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here in conversation with you and with my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Youssef. I don't know if this is by design, but you've chosen sort of Omani and the Bahraini, the two countries that were not visited by President Trump during his Gulf tour. So perhaps that's a way to design a conversation that is perhaps more likely to be, I think, sober and clear-eyed in terms of how we assess this visit. So I think, the visit has been characterized and described in multiple ways, but I would suggest that if we look at the broad thrust of the media coverage, of the optics, of the statements coming out, both from the US and the Gulf side, and then if you look at all the accompanying analysis and that has been written about this topic, I think it's quite clear that there is a sense of overwhelming jubilation. The idea that this is a gold age of US Gulf relations, golden age, I think is, I don't know if President Trump put it himself in those terms, but those are terms that are being used. And in a sense, there is I think a widely held view in the region that sort of the US is back, and that in a sense, we are on the cusp or on the brink of something qualitatively different in US Gulf relations. I tend to take a more, I would say, clear-eyed view, a slightly less, let's say, optimistic view. I tend to think that the visit is obviously very important, and there are very important implications and outcomes from the trip. But I think that there are a lot of frictions, a lot of obstacles, and a lot of impediments as well. And I think we need to temper our expectations despite the grand announcements that have been made. And I admit that I might be somewhat of a minority view here on the Gulf side. I think it's obviously important because of the massive investment pledges. So, 600 billion from Saudi Arabia, 240 billion from Qatar, and then 200 billion from the UAE, plus the 1.2 trillion that the UAE had already committed when the UAE National Security Advisor Sheikh Tahnoun had visited Washington, D.C. And so that's about a total of $2.24 trillion. So that's obviously a very large number. It's quite impressive. And then we've seen most of these deals materialize, a lot of them at least materialize in the tech domain. And that's obviously strategic. It's strategic for the Gulf states. And it's strategic because it's become a key arena of great power competition. We've seen a number of arms deals as well, $142 billion between the US and Saudi Arabia, and over $30 billion between the US and Qatar. And we've seen an easing of US restrictions on the Gulf states' ability to access advanced US technology. And I think that's a very important milestone as well, because it's a shift in US mindset on how to ensure US leadership and to sustain US leadership in AI, and a clear shift from the Biden model, especially the framework on responsible diffusion of AI, that was more about restricting the diffusion of the technology, to one that is more geared towards an open model. And obviously the removal of the sanctions on Syria was obviously also a very important, I think, development. But the reason why I would suggest that we need to temper expectations are as follows. I think first of all, we have to take these investment pledges with a grain of salt. And if you look at the track record of Gulf investments going into the US over the past 10 years, then it will obviously require a doubling, tripling, quadrupling, perhaps even more, increasing by multiple orders of magnitude the amount of gross investments from the Gulf states into the United States economy to be able to reach the kinds of goals and deals that were announced. When we look at the data by Global SWF, and you look at their 10-year data on Gulf investments, on average, over the past 10 years, 2015 to 2024, Saudi Arabia invested about $7 billion annually into the US, the UAE about $5, and Qatar about $500 million, right? So to go from these to the north of $2.2 trillion sum that has been announced, I think would require a significant increase. And this is something, by the way, that even the CEO of Qatar Investment Authority was very clear-eyed about during the Qatar Economic Forum last week. And I think he mentioned this very clearly. So it would require a very significant increase at a time when oil is hovering at between $60 and $65 per barrel, keeping in mind as well all of the domestic spending requirements that Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia and others sort of require, right? So I think we have to take the investment pledges with a grain of salt. The other thing I think is that obviously we have to keep in mind that Trump might be more willing than previous presidents to sell the Gulf states weapons. So the 142 billion deal with Saudi Arabia, he had announced a similar sort of over $100 billion during his first administration. The important thing to keep in mind is that while Trump is willing to sell more weapons, he's less committed to defending the Gulf states than previous, I think, US presidents, especially Biden. Because if you look at the Biden administration, clearly there was an attempt at formalizing, deepening defense and security partnerships. The CCPA agreement that was signed with Bahrain, negotiations with the US, with Saudi Arabia over a binding defense treaty, designating the UAE as a major defense partner, Qatar as a major non-NATO ally. There was a sustained, I think, effort by the Biden administration to formalize these relationships. With Trump, I think Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, was asked just before he met with the Saudi defense minister a few months ago whether the US would be committing to defending Saudi Arabia. And he was, I think, extremely reticent, totally dodged the question. And I think, this goes hand in hand with what we know about the Trump administration's desire not to be sucked into regional conflicts. So I think, the US security and defense commitment is important for the Gulf states. And I think even though we get more arms sales from the Trump administration, and he has already approved multiple important arms sales to Saudi Arabia, including precision guided munitions, including air-to-air missiles, but he's likely to prove less committal. There are geoeconomic tensions as well on trade, and I think there are indirect repercussions of Trump's other trade and geopolitical policies that have to do with China, that have to do with the way Trump has been eroding the sovereignty norm by speaking about annexing Canada, Greenland, Gaza, not to mention all of the regional security files that you've mentioned. But I'll stop there at the moment.
Thank you, Hassan, for these great opening remarks. I think there were several talking points that I believe we will come back to, and I think the biggest of which I think was about US security commitments, how committed is the US, the perceived reliability of the US, and of course not forgetting during Trump 1.0, Mr. Trump famously said, after the attacks on Saudi oil facilities, that there was an attack on Saudi Arabia, there was an attack on us. So we'll come back to that, but let me turn to our second speaker, Yusuf. Over to you.
So, first of all, really thank you, Clemens, and thank you for MEI for this invitation, and I think providing this platform to speak about a very important topic, and as well, I mean, I'm very glad that I'm sharing this discussion with a great friend like Hassan. I think, I mean, I'm really sharing, I mean, in terms of the economic results, I'm really sharing the same sort of reservations which Hassan was referring to. I mean, despite the framing of all of these economic, either economic partnership or investment pledges, or so it's called, I think all of these are really tested through different U.S. administration, and I think, I mean, we can look at it from two angles. One as well, the Gulf countries becomes more and more, clear about, and they understood more the way how to put their messaging out. But having said that, I think I'll just try to focus on complementary side. I will try to focus more into the political results out of this meeting. I think first of all, it was a real unique visit, and it really the speech which President Trump he gave in Saudi, it was a very unique, and I think it's really establishing a new ground where it was very clearly sending the message not only from US, but sending the message from that West ally in general, that we are not here anymore to educate anyone. We are here really to partner with others. I think that was well perceived by the region, that it is the first time, and it's very historic, to see that this relation with the West, I mean, at the end, it really got to realize all the advancement and development happened in the Gulf, and especially in Qatar and Saudi and UAE. So I think that was sending a clear message not only to us internally, but it was sending as well to the rest of the world. It was conquering the importance of the Gulf countries in the regional dynamics, but as well within the new global emerging dynamics. I think the second thing what was clear for me, and it was striking, the level of influence which Trump was clearly trying to show that the Gulf has on some of his policy, and that when he was clearly referring to the removals the sanctions from Syria because of the Prince Mohammed bin Salman. So that's again showing the level of influence, and he was clearly sending that message that he do respect the voice of the Gulf, and he do really as well. Got a line and empowered the line of the policy of de-escalation, which the Gulf is trying to work on in the region. So that was the second very clear. I think the third, which is very important, it is to deepen the de-escalation sentiment in the region. I think talking about Iran, especially in Saudi and in Qatar, it was very clear. It was very clear the talks about toward the de-escalation. It was more and more clear that we want to strike a deal here. It was as well. It was very much clear that in Qatar he was seeking their support as well to try to support the current effort which are going on in Iranian U.S. talks. So I think that's again showing some sort of the importance of the Gulf countries. And I don't want only to speak about, I don't want only to refer to the visit itself, because there is a lot of events in the peace building arena and in the de-escalation sphere, which Trump started to empower from day one when he came to the power in the second term. It was very clear when he agreed to have Russia-Ukraine talks to go through Saudi, and it was very clear as well that even prior his arrival to the power, his special envoy to the Middle East was heavily engaged in the truce which happened in Gaza. Hopefully as well, and what is clear now that there is more and more effort of that. It's trying to harvest in that direction. But at the same time, with all of that importance, I think it's very, very important as well to read that it has been a while since we see such a big event is happening to the Middle East without the US president passing by any other big allies in the region to them. No passing through Israel. That was as well, it's really showing the importance and centrality of the Gulf countries. What I want to conclude with, that despite that there are a lot of reservations in the economic results of this visit, there are at the same time there are a bit of more political positive political result came from this meeting, from this visit. But what I want to stress on that all of these results are not, at least indicating to any big shift in the strategies of the Gulf countries toward diversification. I think they are very much continuing toward that diversification in the relation, and I think maybe that was maybe the biggest. I cannot say loss, but it was one of the achievements which Trump did not went back to Washington with it, that the Gulf countries still remains committed to their diversification of relation despite all of these commitment and pledges. So what we are seeing that with all the outcome from this visit, but there is no shift still in the Gulf mentality to go back to a single ally partnership, but even more to deepen more and more of diversification. That's very important. But as well, I think from the other side, from US side, it's very clear that US are trying to help, but they are more and more isolating themselves from regional dynamics, which is, maybe you can read it that they are giving more agency to the region, but at the same time they are not using their leverage to really de-escalate the situation in the region. So I think we are still in that dilemma in the middle. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Yusuf. Again, a lot of talking points, which I'm going to redirect back to Hassan, some of these to get his views on them. But let me remind our audience that you can put in your questions in the Q&A box, and then we can, of course, address it in the panel. But I wanted to come back to what Yusuf said earlier on the fact that the diversification of international partnerships by the Gulf states will certainly not stop here, despite President Trump's visit. And I wanted to, redirect it back to Hassan on whether he agrees with this statement. On top of another two questions for both speakers: what is the regional perception of U.S. Reliability at the moment? Number one, and number two, how far do you think burden sharing will go as far as the relationship between the Trump administration and their Gulf partners is concerned? So maybe Hassan, you can take this first, and we would like to hear from Yusuf after on burden sharing and reliability.
Yeah, I think it is a very important question, the question of diversification, because I do agree with my friend Yusuf that the Gulf states, I think, at the very top, remain committed to the strategy of diversification. Ideally, they don't want to be forced into zero-sum situations and don't want to have to make difficult choices that they can't afford to make. The issue is whether the United States has managed to undermine diversification from below by locking in the Gulf states, locking them into long-term relationships of dependency, not only in defense, but now increasingly in AI and technology. And the issue here is that there is, I think, a real risk that the Gulf states will overcommit to the United States on the issue of AI and advanced technology, and essentially replicate the same risk profile that they've been trying to sort of address in terms of their deep defense dependencies and how that has been used as a lever of coercive diplomacy against them by the United States in the past. We can think about how, especially during the Saudi-led war in Yemen, for example, and then ask whether they would really want to place themselves in a similar situation when it comes to AI and advanced technology, because the massive investments that have to go into building the infrastructure, the data infrastructure, into building the tech stacks, and all the way up, are extremely costly. They really, I think, could lock in the Gulf states with the United States at a fairly, I think, early point in the trajectory of AI and the way it is rolling out in the world. And I say this partly because of the fact that clearly there are still disruptions and surprises in AI and emerging disruptive technologies and advanced technologies. And so, for example, no one really, except for a few, could see DeepSeek coming and the surprises that the Chinese were able to make with DeepSeek and to achieve interesting results with fewer resources and so on. So this is still very much an industry that is liable, that is vulnerable to disruption, that is vulnerable to surprise. And the Chinese aren't lagging that far behind in reality. They have already managed to catch up and overtake the United States in a large number of areas when it comes to emerging and disruptive technologies. And they might not be very far off when it comes to AI. And I think ultimately it's obviously in the Gulf states and the rest of the countries that are entrants into this field to have as level a playing field as possible between the United States and China, because essentially that creates a better bargaining sort of situation for countries like the Gulf states. So I think there is a risk of overcommitting to the US very early on, because the Gulf states want a first mover advantage, because they want to get the best of the technology today faster than anyone else. They risk being overcommitted to the US. It's not very easy to mitigate this risk, because you could perhaps go for a two systems approach within the different Gulf states. So essentially have an ecosystem that deals with US advanced tech, and another that deals with the Chinese, and essentially separate them and create sort of a firewall between the two. But that's obviously extremely expensive, and I think resource consuming. So there are challenges there, and I think the Gulf states have to think very hard about how they position themselves to mitigate the risk of being over committed to the US. So I think that the risk here is not that that Gulf leaders or Gulf governments are going to formally fully commit to the US across the board and to decouple from China. I agree. I don't think that risk is on the table. But I think there is a risk of that happening from the bottom, with the Gulf states being sucked into relationships of long-term dependence on advanced technology, the same way that sort of materialized on defense.
Thank you, Hassan. Before I turn to Yusuf, I think I have to be a devil's advocate and ask you one more question. Is the US still the undisputed security guarantor for the Gulf after all that you said? And besides the fact there was AI in the mix and all that, would you think that the US remains the undisputed security guarantor for the region, or the wider Middle East as well? Yes.
I don't think that the US is a security guarantor anymore. And I don't think that the US has been a security guarantor for quite some time. When Saudi Arabia was attacked by Iran in 2019, and when Abu Dhabi was attacked by the Houthis in 2021, the US, I think the US's response caused a lot of dissatisfaction in the Gulf, and I think punctured the idea that the US was a security guarantor. The US is the most important defense and security partner for the Gulf states, but it is not a security guarantor. There is no formal binding commitment on the part of the United States to defend the Arab Gulf states in case of attack. The relationship, the agreement that comes closest to that might be the Bahrain-US CCPA agreement, but even that's not a binding defense commitment. That's a commitment to consult, to lend assistance. It approaches the language of the US-Japan sort of Article 5, of the Article 5 of the US-Japan treaty. It approaches it, but again, it's even less committal when it comes to security. Now, mind you, that's not to belittle its importance. It's still the most formalized US security commitment in the region, but it still stops short of a formal and binding defense commitment. And knowing very clearly the Trump administration's desire not to be sucked into any more conflicts in the region, I think it's fair to say that we shouldn't be expecting a US security guarantee. Just look at the way that the Trump administration has handled the Houthis. Right? In March, President Trump promised, quote, to annihilate the Houthis. 2 months later, he signs a ceasefire deal with the Houthis brokered by our Omani friends, right? And so I think that tells you that the US is to a large extent deterred. The Trump administration doesn't have the political will. It doesn't have the backing by its key constituencies to involve itself in further conflict in the region. That might change if Iran were to be seen as an immediate proliferation risk, but I think at the moment we really shouldn't expect the United States to be involved militarily on behalf of the Arab Gulf states.
Thank you, Hassan. A whole chunk of food for thought. We'll come back to Iran later, but I wanted to hear from Yusuf on the same question on burden sharing, reliability, and the US security role.
Okay, so I think, in terms of US security role, and I'll stress on that, and I'll continue on the sort of line which Hassan was laying down. I think absolutely, I don't see by any means that US, even US is portraying themselves, neither the Gulf as asking for any sort of guarantees anymore. I think this guarantee story, it's already, it's behind us. We are now, obviously, and different Gulf states are talking about different partnership and the security, the security framework here nowadays is not only about the hard security, and that's where we see the different security element which we are using are very much dependent. One, it is on the local relevance. I think that we are becoming more and more either productive, either sometimes very important in certain matters, like like being relevant to different corridors, which are linking between different continents. I mean, this relevance, I think this is what we are depending on in our own security nowadays. Now, US remains one of the main partners of that. Absolutely, I totally agree. I don't think that anyone is really replacing US anytime soon in being one of them, in being the main partner of that. And I think, I mean, even in comparing in comparing that to whoever might be the coming second partner onto that, the difference is just very high. And I think even if we will be trying to project what I mean, where would be China in the role of the Gulf security? I think it is very clear, and the message is well received here in the Gulf that China is not another US in the region. They have their own way, they have their own method of doing whatever needed. So I think in terms of security, absolutely, we're just looking for partners. But the good thing as well, that's giving more and more agency to those countries toward not only to their own securities, but even to the wider regional security. And I think if we refer so as I said, I mean, some positive lines of how the regional security, especially for example towards Syria, towards Iran. I mean that agency which was given to the Gulf countries, it was very pivotal. And I think if that will be continued, we need to see. We need really very much to see and monitor that. Is that a very short term, which to be honest, I really think it's very short term. I don't think that's a very strategic, because end of the day, the real security guarantee, I mean, the real security guarantees which US is giving in the region so far, it's only for Israel. And anything would might any of these agency, if potentially might really contradict the interests of their main ally in the region, then the policy might potentially really shift. In terms of, I mean, what we need to realize as well, I think what I can see that, I mean, Trump is really starting to look into the region from more of a regional perspective rather than more of intra-regional dynamics. So exactly what Hassan was referring to, for example, what he did with Houthi. I think my readings that, I mean, the campaign toward Houthi was not only it wasn't from the angle of neither the Yemeni context, neither I think the wider just regional context, but it was really an indication because it was coming on the same night when the first letter from Trump got to Tehran. So I think that was a message going from the perspective to put the enough pressure toward Iran, and that's more and more giving us an understanding that this is more of a regional matter. And the moment we started seeing that the talks are getting to a shape where the confidence are just being there, I mean, the campaign was called to stop. So more of a regional angle rather than more of a country level angle or national angle. That's what we are seeing, and I cannot be really that much of optimistic to this angle. I think because with that there is a lot of stereotyping and generalization will happen, and with hands-off policy, it will create a lot of frozen conflicts rather than it will create solution toward those conflicts. And what we are seeing at the moment, that a lot of these conflicts which we are seeing in the region, which are getting to frozen situation, we are seeing the spillover of these are going to new regions like Horn of Africa. So I don't think I'm that much optimistic toward this angle.
I think we are getting a couple of questions in from the floor, but I wanted to capitalize on one of your comments, which was on Iran, before I turn to Hassan. But I wanted to ask you, Yusuf, another question since we are on topic of Iran, was that, of course, we are all aware that US-Iran talks are ongoing. And one striking thing that was mentioned during Trump's speech in Riyadh was that he said enemies get you motivated. And he said he will never hesitate to wield American power if it's necessary to defend the US or help defend its allies. And of course, that was taking an aim at Iran. So my question to you, Yusuf, how far do you see US-Iran talks progressing? Is a deal within reach? And will such a deal be packaged with, proxy activities or eliminating these proxy activities from that are, in Iran's orbit? So, Yusuf, what's your take?
I think my take, to be honest, I'm very cautiously optimistic toward the talks. I think in terms of the willingness from both sides, it's very much clear that both of them are willing this time to really get to a deal. We spent the first couple of rounds in general to really try to understand was that more of a tactic to go to a wider action, or was that a real strategy to go to the negotiation and diplomacy? And I think it's very clear from both sides, and that's a topic itself. But there are enough reasons for both sides really to consider the diplomacy this time, in particular, and I think the line which Trump was referring to in his speech in Saudi, Iran confirmed that line will not be crossed, and especially if we're talking about the line of reaching to a nuclear race in the region. I think that was very clearly communicated that that's not the case. In general, what we can see that there are still a lot of details to be sorted out, and these details, I think there is some sort of understanding on the main lines, and this time I think, which is making it more and more relevant, that the region is really well aware about the progress. And from all parts. So you see after every meeting, Iranian, they are going around the region, Omanis as well, they're having different calls as a mediator with the region and trying to keep everyone is really involved to minimize the number of stakeholders or countries who are really left out. No doubt that the risk of keeping Europe away for a while, that's a risk, and it should be really considered very well. But the region, I think this time the region is totally in a different situation. We have very much, we have rapprochement with Iran, with Saudi. We have majority of the relation from the neighboring, Arab Gulf countries. Majority of them, not all of them, are having this normalized, relations. I think that's bringing us to a different context in terms of providing positivity toward it. Now, the very interesting topic which you mentioned, it is about the regional matters and how much that can be included in whatever discussion. I don't think the regional matters can be a bilateral discussion between US and Iran. Maybe there are certain initial understanding to unlock discussions on the regional level. Maybe that something can be considered, but absolutely without including the region fully, no point and no chance for discussion about any regional de-escalation should take place. Because I think with that, it's a very strategic mistake if anyone will take that line. But again, what I will conclude with, I think I'm cautiously optimistic so far, but still what we were seeing even up to last night, when again there is a lot of threats to spoil that deal coming from Netanyahu. But we hope that there's something will be harvested much before than this to be spoiled.
Thank you, Yusuf. Yeah, and you're quite right about determining, the bridge, the negotiating positions in terms of the red line between zero enrichment and weaponization. So what is your take, Hassan, on the US-Iran talks?
It's interesting. It's
I think clear that there is a willingness to talk at the moment, and that's good considering the alternative, which is unilateral military action, especially on the part of Israel or the United States, which, by the way, remains a possibility. I mean, Netanyahu is obviously a spoiler and risks trying to spoil these talks through unilateral action. And when you speak to American officials, they will describe to you how difficult it is for them to try and rein in Israel. Now, the question is, how far is Netanyahu willing to go and defying Trump and so on? And that's obviously an empirical question. But I think that risk, although minimized, is still very much on the table. The other risk, obviously, is that the Iranians are buying time to wait out essentially and the window during which the ability to bring back snapback sanctions on Iran expires. And then once that window of time expires, Iran will be in a better bargaining position because the Western countries will no longer be able to bring back snapback sanctions. Now, that doesn't mean that the Iranians will necessarily walk away from the negotiation, but at least they might want to wait until that window of time expires so that they can then bargain for get a better deal because the coercive element of bringing back snapback sanctions against the Iranians will no longer be on the table in the same way. So again, I mean, there are important details to consider, including what is going to be the scope of this negotiation, for how long will it essentially put a lid on Iran's nuclear program. And there are many scenarios, I think, and many possibilities that may or may not address the various concerns of the different countries in the region. And we simply don't, I think, have enough insight into the details of the talks to be able to make a determination either way. The interesting detail, to my mind, is the extent to which the Arab Gulf states are now probably actually supportive of these negotiations versus when they viewed those negotiations as a potential a threat back in 2015. So back in 2015, the most of the Arab Gulf states, with the exception of Oman, which was obviously brokering those talks, were rather dissatisfied to see that the negotiations focused exclusively on Iran's nuclear program and didn't take the ballistic missiles program or Iran's networks of regional influence into account. And therefore, this essentially excluded the things that mattered the most from the Gulf states' perspectives, and then the Gulf states were essentially kept out of the loop. This time around, as my friend Yusuf, I think, aptly described, the Gulf states are very much in the loop. They're involved. They support, I think, the negotiations because Iran's networks of regional influence have essentially been taken care of by Israel, and so they're not as big of a concern. The ballistic missiles program, the drones and the cruise missiles are very much a reality. And I think there's no putting that genie back into the bottle. And so, if anything, I think the Gulf states are probably supportive of this because they most certainly, I think, don't want to see a war with Iran at their doorstep because they know that they will be on the firing line. The Gulf states host anywhere between 35 to 40,000 American troops. There is some U.S. presence of some description in almost each and every one of the 6 Gulf states, and they know that they are much more vulnerable to Iranian attack than is Israel, and are likely to be on the front line of this battle. So I think the Gulf states, if anything, are in favor of de-escalation. And this, I think, going back to the earlier point about the end of the notion of U.S. security guarantee, is that I agree. It has essentially forced the Gulf states to rethink the way they approach Iran and other regional competitors and even their own differences. And I think it partly explains why we saw a strong Gulf push post-COVID, post-2019, for regional de-escalation and problem solving, including the Gulf Rift between Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Qatar, including de-escalating relations with Turkey, and perhaps most importantly, de-escalating relations with Iran. And so we're now seeing diplomacy and de-escalation as a core component of the Gulf states' respective toolkits for addressing regional threats, on top, obviously, of cultivating defense and security relationships with the US and other partners, and building their own deterrent capabilities. We see this tendency to engage more in diplomacy, conflict resolution, de-escalation, and mediation as becoming a central component of the Gulf states' strategies for managing regional threats and conflicts.
I think we dealt with one regional file and we addressed it in terms of in the form of Iran. But let us turn to another regional file because we do have a question from the floor, which is Syria. And President Trump made quite a speech in Riyadh when he said, he denounced Western intervention in the region. And towards the end of the same speech, he also delivered breaking news saying that the US will lift sanctions on Syria. So what are the regional implications? Will that lead to regional integration? Will the Gulf countries deepen their cooperation with Syria? Yusuf, perhaps we'll start with you.
I think in general, the decisions over Syria, it's very positive and important decision. But there are two things here we need always to keep in mind. One, the implementation of decision. We know, after the speech, that implementation would go through its own bureaucracy inside US, and how much of that, what does that mean, leaving all or cessing all the sanctions? What does that mean when that will be implemented? That's something obviously we need to consider. But the second thing, which is very much important, that with looking to the Syrian situation, looking to the internal Syrian dynamics, it does have a lot of challenges yet. This is one of the challenges, which is very important that it's paved the way. But there are a lot. Still we are talking about, territorial integrity. Still we are talking about, a comprehensive, government. Still we are talking about a risk from Israel is on Syria. Still we are talking about, the borders with Iraq and the relation there should be reconciled. And still we're talking about, the residual tensions or residual work toward Lebanon, and how the relation can be normalized. So I think this is very positive toward enabling the current Syrian, as the President Trump himself, he said that we are giving them a chance. I think this is a good chance. But still I want to stress on the level of risk which the current Syrian situation are really surrounded with. I cannot see that. One, we are really waiting. All of us here, we are really waiting for seeing the implementation of the sanction assessing or living up. So that's very important to understand how and what and when that would happen. The good thing so far that Saudi and Qatar, they paid off all the debts, especially to the international bank, to the World Bank, from on behalf of Syria. So there are some positive enablers toward the current Syrian administration, but that's again are not leaving the real question on the current administration, especially when we are referring, as I said, as I highlighted, just generally, still we have a lot of local components which should be dealt with closely, and until we see a more unified administration, I think till then we cannot really project the reflection. I can see that this decision was really very, very important economically, and the very importance of this decision as well, that the price which Syrian should pay, or Syrian administration here I refer to, it wasn't clear. So that's why we're still waiting to see the implementation, to understand what are the procedural prices which will be needed there. And if it is about more just a procedural but not a political prices, then that might be going very smooth. But if we will be seeing more of conditions will be flowing in I mean, in front of doing that, especially, I mean, when we are talking about the foreigner fighters situation inside the Syrian current army. This is one of the very sensitive topics which US was really putting in front as a condition. So I think all of these are again leaving us to think that this is a very historical moment. It is a very great enabler, and it shows as well the commitment of the region, of the Gulf states, when they were really pushing, and especially Saudis, putting all of that, influence or leverage, try to help them, and managed really not only to leave the sanctions, but as well, managed to have a face-to-face meeting. I think that was very much important for the legitimacy given to the current administration. So I think from my side, I don't want to repeat this, but I'm very cautiously as well looking to this neutral cautiously. I cannot say I'm optimistic, but as well it is. I think it is a wonderful opportunity for Syrian to seize and take their country and nation to the second level.
Thank you, Yusuf. Over to you, Hassan, for your assessment.
Yeah, I think it's quite clear that the Gulf states have a major strategic objective in Syria, which is to stabilize the post-Assad transition and stabilize the massive geopolitical gain from the fall of the Assad regime, which essentially interrupted the Iranian land corridor that linked Iran through Iraq to the Mediterranean. And by doing so, has essentially isolated Hezbollah from its supply lines that used to cut across Syria and from its wider strategic depth. So I think we have to remember that the fall of the Assad regime has created a massive, I think, geostrategic dividend for the Gulf states, and I think they have every interest in ensuring that this remains the case and in ensuring the success of the post-Assad transition in Syria. There are multiple risks on the horizon. There is the risk, obviously, that Syria falls into the Turkish orbit of influence, and I think this is an outcome that, with the exception of Qatar, no one in the Gulf wants to see. There's also, obviously, the potential splintering up of Syria into various territorial entities. And if you look at the way that Israel has been investing into the Druze minority and essentially instigating separatism within the Druze minority, or the way in which Iran or Russia might seek to reinvigorate Alawite demands for ethnic separatism, then I think there is a real risk that Syria ends up fragmenting into multiple failed states, and I think this is something that the Gulf states will not want to see either. So I think it's quite clear that the Gulf states have been mobilizing both their diplomatic and economic and financial tools. Diplomatically, as we all know, they played an important role in persuading President Trump, especially Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, to lift these sanctions on Syria. And economically, they've intervened by paying off Syria's debts to the World Bank. The Qataris have pledged to pay off public sector salaries. The Emiratis have signed an $800 million deal to manage the port of Tartus. So there really is, I think, a desire for the Gulf states to come in, to place investments, and essentially to provide the Shara-led administration with the economic tools that it needs to deliver a victory dividend to show Syrians that the situation post-Assad is better than the situation under Assad, and essentially to allow him to deliver on economic prosperity, obviously relative economic prosperity, and then hopefully to engineer a transition towards a future in which Syria essentially behaves like a normal state that does not essentially export drugs or terrorism to the rest of the region. I think this is the broad strategic ambition of the Gulf states, and I think they're clearly mobilizing diplomatic and economic tools to try and get there.
Thank you. Thank you, Hassan. And I think we we just again addressed another regional file, but the file there is of course the big elephant in the room is of course Gaza, and we probably have to come to this file as well and to hear your views on this, and of course the 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 biggest and most glaring omission from Trump's visit and program was Israel. Israel was omitted from his program, his visits, and in addition to that, Trump has bypassed Netanyahu on several occasions, including announcing talks with Iran, securing a deal directly with the Houthis, establishing a private system for aid delivery in Gaza. So, can you provide an assessment on whether you see an end game to Gaza under the Trump administration? Of course, I think it's a very difficult question to answer, but what is your take? I mean, the president has said during his campaign, get it over with, let's get back to peace. He wants to deliver peace in the region. But what is your take? Perhaps this time around we'll switch the sequence. We'll start with Hassan.
Yeah, I think it's, there is some daylight clearly between Trump and Netanyahu, and I think the Gulf states may have contributed to driving a bit of a wedge between Trump and Netanyahu by the Omanis facilitating direct talks between the US and Iran, which I think Netanyahu believes have no chance of real success in his definition of success, by facilitating the ceasefire with the Houthis, the Saudis by facilitating the US lifting of sanctions on Syria. And so I think, and then of course the Qataris also brokering direct negotiations between the US and Hamas. All of these things have happened, I think, despite the Israelis, despite Netanyahu's preferences and interests. So there is a bit of daylight between the Americans and the Israelis, and the Gulf states have contributed to that. But I think, if you step back and in the grand scheme of things, the Israelis are totally unrestrained. They've launched hundreds of strikes on Syria. They continue to attack Lebanon, and obviously continue to provoke Palestinians and Muslims globally at the Al-Aqsa Mosque and in Jerusalem. They continue to increase and expand illegal settlements in the West Bank, and quite clearly, I think, commit a live-streamed ongoing campaign of starvation, extermination, and genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. And I think we have to recognize that it is a collective strategic and moral failure on the part of the Arab countries, including, I think, the Gulf states, not to have been able to extract meaningful concessions, actual tangible concessions from the US and from the Trump administration on the Palestinian file. Trump has essentially espoused the proposal for the total depopulation of Gaza and potentially even a US annexation or control over the Gaza Strip. He hasn't really, I think, in any formal sense, officially changed his mind when it comes to that. And it's quite clear that he has, in effect, de facto given Israel free hand to continue its campaign of extermination in Gaza. So I think, this is I think the largest moral and strategic failure that we see on the part of the Arab states. I don't think there is any. The only end state, the only end goal that we see is the end goal that Netanyahu and his extreme right-wing allies want, which is the ethnic cleansing of Gaza and eventually the annexation of Gaza and perhaps even the West Bank. And I think we have to keep in mind that, yes, the Gulf states have been able to work well with the tech sphere around Netanyahu, people like Elon Musk and others. They've been able to work well with Witkoff. But let's keep in mind that there's a very strong, committed group of Christian Zionists within the Trump administration, including Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, Mike Huckabee, and others. And those two have, I think, an influence and an impact. And I think the Arab states need to think very hard about how they deal with this issue.
I think Hassan really put it rightly. I don't have that much to add, but what I want really to mention here that literally the personal policy of Bibi Netanyahu, it is the most disruptive. It is the most disruptive driver in the region at the moment. And what we are witnessing out of I mean, out of really trying to escalate and drag the region to a more of a blood shed and dragging the situation worse and worse. I think, I mean, that itself is just telling us that keeping us in a position where how this personalized policy can be contained. Because I think if we want to think about Gaza and how to deal with Gaza, we need really to think about how, I mean, all of the wording of the worst genocide, this apartheid which we are seeing. I mean, and all of the words, and not only in Gaza. I mean, the attacks in Syria. I mean, currently, I just read my notifications. There are another attack on Sana'a airport. I mean, this continuation of destruction in the region, which is continuous to happen from Netanyahu, that's the most disruptive. And to be honest, I don't see any real light. And the only light what we are seeing, and to be honest here again from the Omani perspective, what we are seeing, if we can get the region to a momentum where at least one of other deals other than Gaza can be reached to, that might put further pressure on US and on the current US administration to move more clearly. The only thing which is really important, and I think that what we need to realize, and that's what the GCC state, they realize it, and they are trying to portray it and discuss it with the rest, that obviously Netanyahu, with all of his acts, is trying to really escalate and instigate reactions from others to have a more escalatory curve up. But staying away from all of these regional countries for not being dragged to Netanyahu's attempt of escalation, that's the only way which will drive more and more gap between Netanyahu and Trump. And I think this non-reaction to all of his instigating policies, that's what is creating this momentum, which absolutely I agree with Hassan, that the Gulf countries, they contributed to that very much. We need just to build on that more and more until there is a clear momentum will be created either internally inside Palestine, inside Israel against him, or a more clear position from Trump to be taken. Again, this refers us to the initial discussion we had about the guarantees, and I think this is where it's very clear that yet Trump is not taking this guarantees commitment at all. It's not because we are looking for guarantees, but again, his involvement is very much not contradictory with Netanyahu. So the situation is still very negative there. It's heartbreaking, and we hope that something can move there in a positive direction.
Thank you, Yusuf, and thank you both for answering the question on this pretty thorny subject. But I wanted, while we are still on the subject of Israel, I wanted to ask both of you, because prior to the October 7 events, and we saw that piece from Jake Sullivan, the former national security advisor of the US. He wrote that the Middle East has never been quieter than in decades. But of course, then the October 7 events happened, and that led to a great deal of other things. I wanted to ask, and of course, American interlocutors will tell me that none of the Abraham Accord signatories have broken away despite October 7. And I want to ask, that issue of Saudi-Israel normalization that has come up constantly in the media, is it delayed, disrupted, or destroyed in these current circumstances? Perhaps I'll start with Hassan first.
I think it's quite clear at the very least that we're not about to see a Saudi-Israeli normalization anytime soon. And I think that's partly because Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, has committed time and time again, both in domestic and in international fora, not to normalize relations with Israel unless there is a clear and viable pathway to a Palestinian state. And I think that has been repeated on multiple occasions and should dispel any notions that this is simply a bluff, and that given the right set of incentives, the Saudis will totally sort of crumble on that issue. I think the Saudis have been quite principled in this regard. If anything, they've upped the diplomatic ante by co-leading with Norway and others, the global coalition for the two-state solution. And I think the Saudis were really irritated when Prime Minister Netanyahu essentially on during an interview said that if the Saudis cared very much about the Palestinian state, that they should have one in their own territories. And I think that was sort of a rude awakening that, in a sense, reconfirmed, I think, the idea that Netanyahu is not someone that they can work with. So I think so long as Israel continues to head in an annexationist direction, be it in Gaza and or in the West Bank, I think it becomes very difficult to see why the Saudis would incur the domestic and the regional and really and the global reputational and diplomatic and political cost of taking such a step with Israel at the moment. If anything, Israel is growing internationally more isolated from its traditional partners and allies. The German chancellor now is talking about his inability to understand Israel's policies within any sort of rational context of fighting Hamas. And so, when the German chancellor starts saying that, that things are getting really, really bad, I think, and that Israel has reached a point of international isolation that I think is really extreme. So I really don't see any real incentive. I think the flip side and the other thing to keep in mind is that the Trump administration has decoupled some of the most important conversations with Saudi Arabia from the question of normalization with Israel. And so it has broken with the Biden administration's track record on this issue. The Americans are now willing to talk about arms and defense deals. They're willing to talk about AI and advanced technology and civil nuclear energy with Saudi Arabia, irrespective and in a manner that is disconnected from the discussion and the conversation about the question of normalization. So in a sense, the pressure is no longer very much on the Saudis. They realize that they're able to move ahead with the Trump administration on these significant and strategic issues without necessarily taking the step of normalizing relations with Israel.
Thank you, Hassan. Over to you, Yusuf. What's your take on Saudi-Israel normalization? Disrupted, destroyed, or delayed?
Destroyed. I think it's very much destroyed. I don't see that there is any chance for this to happen. But we need here as well to be very careful. I know that our brothers in the kingdom, they are trying their best within this coalition of recognizing the Palestinian statehood, and that might need some sort of actions if there is bigger countries would be called to join that recognition, and so maybe going to a recognition that in a cost of getting a bigger recognition to Palestine, that would be a vital at a certain time to build a political base. So there are these discussions around the idea of maybe getting U.S., France recognizing Palestine. And that might come with a cost, but I don't think that it might come with any cost of normalization. I think normalization is a path which is really a way, and with all of these disruptive policies, I don't think anyone, even if there is any clear deal from Netanyahu or from the current Israeli administration, I think, even if I can add to what Hassan was saying, I think the initial discussion was toward a path toward statehood. I think nowadays there is no trust even to agree on a path. I think the real guarantee it is to recognize a Palestinian statehood, because just the path with the current Israeli administration will not be enough. We saw a lot of these commitments and several attempts of peace with the Arab countries, including the Abrahamic Accord, and nothing was delivered from their side. So I think, I mean, even this language we started seeing in the latest statements from Saudi, that nothing can be discussed without a two-state solution and a recognition for Palestinian state. But I think in the wider, I cannot see at all any context or entrance for such a thing to really fly. But again, with keeping in mind that the current coalition, international coalition to recognize Palestine, that might bring a bit of cost if we want bigger countries to join. So if US, France, Germany, UK, if they are considering to join this coalition to start recognizing the statehood of Palestine, that might bring a cost, but absolutely that cost will not be the normalization.
Thank you, Yusuf. And certainly, I think the statement released by the Saudis some time back on the pathway, that exact word was sufficiently vague. But I think, with the kind of government Netanyahu has, it's quite challenging and difficult to see any prospects of that happening. But we have just time for one more question to wrap up our discussion. This has been intriguing so far. We could go on for hours, but I think because of the fact that we have been on the regional chessboard so much, I wanted to take it up one level and go back to one of your comments earlier, Hassan, that you mentioned that the tech domain will be a key arena of great power competition, you said in your opening remarks. And I wanted to come back to that to open up the discussion on a higher level, on another level, because there has been a long-standing concern from Washington that Chinese communication infrastructure would enable backdoor access to areas that could trigger, US national security anxiety. So one example, of course, was the suspended procurement of F-35s by the UAE, when the US expressed concerns that Huawei technology in Abu Dhabi would be used or could be used for potential espionage. So could we be seeing the same thing in Trump's AI deals going forward, or his chip diplomacy, as they call it? And, would that have been communicated by Trump officials to their Gulf counterparts? Let's start with Yusuf this time, and then we'll finish off with Hassan to wrap up our discussion. Yusuf, all yours.
So I think, maybe Hassan, he's more aware about the matter of the AI, but I think this confidence on a regular commitment in transferring technology from US and in different presidential occasion, I think that's something always was around, and I think that's why it led to great times when it led to a more diversification to start getting the technologies even from other places. I think if I will focus more even in what UAE's reaction was, even after their heavy agreement or severe important agreements with US, what we are seeing as well, they are keeping that balance to keep as well their investment with the East, as well as it's moving with the West. So China as well, it is within their orbit of AI. So what I'm expecting that this is always the risk of really stopping the deals for whatever reason, despite how much you can provide as a position. These are some gray areas which is always used for internal consumption into the big capitals dynamics, and that's well understood. So I think the only way of getting something done sometimes it is after having all of this huge coverage and creating the momentum. It is to execute it as fast as you can. That what can take us. But I mean, at the same time, and we don't need to forget that, I mean, despite how powerful are those technologies which we are seeing coming from the West, but recent and he's in a much better situation in referring to that, especially in the defense one. But the recent confrontation between India and Pakistan was as well clearly showing, I mean, the efficiency of the Chinese technologies and equipment in that confrontation. So I think what we might see that there would be a push, but I don't think that, at least for me, I don't think that I'll be that much comfortable until I see a clear execution of such a deal. Now, in the sphere of AI, that I think it would be it will be more I think eligible to be delivered, rather than, because in defense are more sensitive from the perspective, at least what we used to hear. But in AI, I think you cannot hold these, and the level of investment and the level of enabler which are available in the GCC countries to execute these projects, either from fund, from energy, from location, from all of that. It's really a true enabler to see that, I mean, these type of investment, I think it might proceed, I mean, more efficient.
Thank you, Yusuf. Hassan, you have the last word.
Great, thank you very much. So I think you're right to point out to these security concerns, and it's quite. And they've been a very important part of the conversation within the US about the right approach to the question of the diffusion of advanced US technology, be they chips, AI models, and so on. And obviously, you may recall the great lengths to which the UAE and G42 went during negotiations with the Biden administration to strip out Chinese tech stack, Chinese hardware from their data centers, and essentially to remove any Chinese nationals or affiliates from managing these companies and these data centers. So the UAE was willing to go to length, really to, I think, to a considerable extent, to assuage some of these US security concerns. Let's also keep in mind that obviously, the question of Chinese companies working with the Chinese government also applies on the US side of things. I mean, the US has explicit legislation called the US Cloud Act that essentially forces US headquartered US cloud operators to transfer back to the US government any data held on US run data centers that the US may require. So, this risk is also very much on the table with the United States. And I think it's simply, the realities the technological realities that middle and less technologically advanced countries sort of have to accept and deal with. Now, the issue, I think, is really to understand the nature of the bargaining relationship between the US and the Gulf states. And I think to do that, you have to answer several questions, including to what extent is this industry, AI, semiconductors, and so on, to what extent is it going to be democratized? Will the barriers to entry become lower over time? Is this technology going to become more diffuse, or will it remain extremely concentrated in the hands of a few? I think, where are the bottlenecks and the choke points going to be? So I think, we have to understand the nature of this industry and the extent to which it remains concentrated, or the extent to which it becomes more democratized over time. And then we have to understand the bargaining power of the Gulf states. Because if the Gulf states, as Yusuf suggested, are going to be key enablers by bringing very important and vast sums of financial capital to bear, by the energy abundance that they have to offer in order to run data centers, their geographic location, their geopolitical neutrality that allows them to partner with many different countries, then if we take these things into account, then perhaps it becomes a more level playing field where it's not just the Gulf states that need access to US technology, but it's also the US that needs access to Gulf partnerships that offer finance and energy, geographic proximity, and foreign relations and foreign partnerships to be able to sustain US global leadership when it comes to AI and semiconductors. So I think we have to really understand the nature of the playing field here by looking at what the Gulf states bring to the table, by looking at the evolving nature of this industry, and I think that is going to be a key determinant of how these relationships and these alignments play out.
Thank you, Hassan. There you have it. We have come to the end of today's enthralling discussion. It was a great discussion among friends, colleagues, and certainly experts. And I hope the audience who tuned in benefited a lot from the insights of our speakers. I certainly have, for sure. So thank you again to our speakers, Yusuf and Hassan, for joining us today and sharing and lending your brains and sharing your insights with us. I also thank our operational team for making this happen. And I look forward to having you both again on one of our MEI events. Thank you, Hassan and Yusuf, and to our audience again.